absolutely, I recognize the challenge for investigative agencies to legitimately undertake operations. And few people would argue that those kind of institutions, organizations need some way of investigating crimes, particularly terrorism related, against our adversaries.
Cyber attacks are in the news once again, with a sophisticated attack being aimed at the federal government. This is Tech Society FM, and I'm your host, Alex Dunmo, and with me is John Newen. In today's episode, we speak with Dr. Paul Haskell-Dowland. Paul is the Associate Dean for Computing and Security at Edith Cowan University. And Paul has more than 20 years of experience in cybersecurity research and education in both the UK and Australia. We chat all things cybersecurity with Paul, and we put it to him, how can we protect ourselves, and what's coming that we should be afraid of? All right. Well, thank you for joining us. It's pretty cool. You're in a operations center there.
So this is our security operations center.
Cool.
The smaller one of the two. This is the dark one. So yeah, this particular room is an 8-seat SOC and is really going to be used from next semester for students embedding themselves in cyber operations. So all the stuff on the screens behind is completely meaningless.
Oh, it's like my screen, see that?
Purely for media benefit.
I got the Matrix thing going on my screen, so.
Yes, I saw that a moment ago. I said there, yeah, I can definitely see that. So I think your mic setup is a bit better than mine.
Oh, we do this a lot more, I think.
A bit more investment in me.
It's not too bad though. Ultimately, the information we get is valuable, regardless of what microphone you have.
Yeah.
In the end.
But a decent mic helps.
It does. And a lot of people just work off their laptop devices.
Yeah.
It's not made for broadcast. It's not made to video conference all the time. And I think, since COVID kicked in, everyone's rudely forced into the whole world of online video. No one's ready. Webcams are sold out everywhere.
Everyone disrupted the supply chain. Now I can't buy nice things.
I had this already, so I was
Who really
lucky.
needs a decent webcam?
Not most people, honestly. I think for standard business meetings, you can get by with a potato. All right. Well, tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about being the Dean for Computing and Security.
Sure. So my name is Paul Haskell-Dowland. I'm the Associate Dean for Computing and Security at Edith Cowan University. An Associate Dean is an interesting role. It's one that I have come to relatively recently, been 4 years in the position here at ECU. And as you can probably tell by the accent, I'm originally from the UK and spent a good 16 years prior to my arrival in Australia as an academic at a UK university, taking various roles and eventually working my way up to an associate head there. And then the opportunity came to relocate to Australia. And why wouldn't you? What a beautiful place to live. And I've taken on the role of an associate dean, which for most people isn't an obvious title. You wouldn't necessarily know what that means. And in the context of education, an associate dean is probably closest aligned to a head of school role. So in a traditional university structure of schools and faculties or schools and colleges, the associate dean role sort of sits as the head of school and reports up to another structure just above before going up towards the sort of chancellery level management of the university. So ultimately, I've got responsibility for the discipline area of computing and security, and that covers computer science, information technology, obviously cybersecurity, as we're talking about today, but it also includes a really interesting area called security science, which covers off on areas like physical security, so things like premises, but also the area of counterterrorism and security and the application of intelligence in analysing what you might consider to be wicked problems, and particularly in the current situation, how we can use intelligence and information to solve particularly difficult problems. And obviously in the current COVID situation, having access to good quality data, being able to analyse it, interpret it, and to make policy and decisions is absolutely critical. So it's a really interesting area because it's an overlap of technology and the sort of human sciences, which perfectly aligns with cybersecurity.
I was going to say, because a lot of people neglect the human sciences perspective, but that's the easiest way to get someone's password.
You also, yeah, exactly. So there's a physical security that you look at as well.
Social engineering.
Right? Is it all revolving around the cybersecurity in the end? So the physical, social aspect of getting access to a network, or is it also security in general?
So the security science course areas look at the wider issues of security. So the cybersecurity course, certainly in terms of people's perspectives, aligns very closely with technology. But we always correct that view very quickly, that realistically, as we just explained, the human factor is the vast majority of the problem.
The wrench solution. Yeah. So is it that XKCD comic where you use a wrench to beat someone up to get the password? It's a lot easier.
It's much easier, much quicker, much more efficient, less likely to get caught.
The term cybersecurity, is that, do you find that's expansive enough then? I guess everyone knows what cybersecurity is. Obviously, it's a good kind of marketing term, but what would you call it if you got to rename the area?
That's a very good question. I actually quite like the moniker cybersecurity. So it really plays to the stereotypes of security, and that works well with the lovely maps behind me. You know, it's important to present the image that people recognize of cybersecurity, because you talk to anybody about cyber, and if they know what it is, they're probably visualizing people in a darkened room just like this, with pretty graphs on the screens showing what's happening. The real life of a cybersecurity analyst or a cybersecurity expert is far removed from these kinds of rooms. This stuff happens. There are roles as a cyber operations analyst, but it's only a very small part of cybersecurity. So, you know, looking at it holistically is important. But I think that the name cybersecurity at the moment is a very powerful one, and a very useful one. It's in the media, it's in people's minds, and it has a dark undertone, which does work to the stereotypes within cyber, but it's also not too evil sounding. So I think it's probably a good name to be going with for the time being.
There must be a lot more of a focus now than there ever has been before. You must have seen the budgets for like cybersecurity initiatives go up considerably in the last decade.
So certainly cybersecurity is much more in the forefront of managers, executives, the C-suite, and you know, pretty much every organization now has somebody or some bodies with a responsibility for cybersecurity. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of organizations out there, particularly in the smaller scale, who simply don't have that in-house capacity. So whilst big organizations have got the budget and the physical human resource to deal with the major problems, the smaller organizations are really struggling. So yes, budgets have increased, but not necessarily universally across all size organizations. And that's an area that needs redress. And it's something that certainly ECU is very keen to support and to enable SMEs to have greater access to cybersecurity.
Cyber's one of those things. It's hard to justify
cybersecurity,
a security analyst for a small business, right?
It's like backups. You don't realize how important backups are until you don't have one, and you don't realize how important cybersecurity is until someone hacks your Office 365. And
or ransomware comes in and just locks everything up, and then you really wish you had those backups, or you really wish you had that security guy to worry about what matters before it really happens.
And the backups are great, but simply having backups is nowhere near enough. You've got to be sure that they work and that they're restorable. There are many incidents in organizations where they've invested lots of money in their backup strategy, but then failed to check that they were actually working properly.
Disaster recovery is another step that a lot of people just forget about.
Yes, not many organizations have got the hot failover site, and the disaster recovery plan may be there, but if it's never tested, then I don't want to be trialing that on the day you actually need it.
Sounds like you've done this before.
We've seen most things. So being in a university, you're quite privileged that you can go into organizations, you can talk to people. You're not a salesman. I'm not representing a company selling them a technology solution. So they often are a bit more forthright and forthcoming with their views, but also with their experiences. And some of the things that are happening out there are horrific. They're terrifying in some organizations, especially in critical infrastructure.
Yes.
But work is being done to address it. And we just need more people out there spreading the word, supporting particularly the small organizations. And the big ones can take care of themselves mostly. But
no, they don't.
The smaller organizations that really
it changes, doesn't it? It reminds me of the Y2K bug, where after Y2K, everyone was like, there was no problem. It was fine. It's because it was fixed.
A lot of money was spent fixing.
That's right. Similar kind of issue.
A relatively trivial problem. But yeah, it was a very interesting time. I remember the Y2K issues. I wasn't actively in the industry at that point. I was an academic. But it was really interesting sitting on the outside looking in and, just thinking, well, if you wrote your software properly, this wouldn't be a problem. But, you don't think of it 30 yeyears ago that this would be a problem.
No, definitely not. Then we got the Unix epoch thing happening in
2038.
Yeah, that'll be another big one. Harder to explain though.
It's a bit more, it's a bit like the GPS bugs that we had a couple of years ago. People just don't think about these things. And, I've written software many times over the years, and I'm sure if I was to look back at what I wrote 10 years ago, I'd be horrified.
Oh, for me, it's just all the time. You look back and who is this guy? Who wrote this? It's pretty common. On the topic of people not being aware, I think the data privacy thing is something we should look at, because everyone seems to care more about privacy lately, but at the same time, they're not actually aware of what happens to their data. It gets mined, it gets recorded, observed constantly, but you're not even aware. So things like the ISP metadata laws, or just general OAuth across different websites that still link back to Facebook. They can still track you without you logging in. So what are your thoughts on the status of privacy and how it's really fallen? People care more about it, but at the same time, it's hard to manage.
They care about it, but they're not prepared to change to be able to improve it. Is what we often find. So certainly the issue of convenience over security is a common problem. We always use the argument, well, everything's in Google, in Facebook, all that data mining is going on. So should we really worry about it? There's enough data out there that another website is not going to tip us over the edge. I think we need to get a bit of a better handle on the implications of privacy. We are very familiar with the issues of identity theft, and it's increasingly getting to the stage where somebody in your inner circle, your immediate friends and family, will have suffered some kind of incident. And it may not be a major one, but they'll have had some kind of problem caused by a breach of privacy. And for me, the best example that I show people is the Have I Been Pawned website.
Oh, yes.
So, here's a website, put your email address in, and just see how many times it has been picked up.
It's terrifying. It's
Have I Pwned is
pretty much every major service has been breached at some point.
I do the same thing. I show people Have I Been Pwned, and they're shocked. And then you find out that yes, they do indeed use the same password for every service.
It's convenience. That's why.
And that behavior doesn't necessarily change when you show them that.
Yeah,
so we have got a huge issue that people want convenience. People want high levels of flexibility, easy access to resources, single sign-on, pass-through from websites. And realistically, we're not going to get away from that. So I think education is still the critical factor, and encouraging people to recognize that there are risks, to attribute value to their data. And even if the only value they attribute to it is the resale value. So recognizing that their email address has a price, and that if that website stores their credit card, that the credit card has a price. And yes, you can block it. Yes, you can recover your losses in most cases, but the inconvenience having to go and get a new card issued and having to explain to the bank how it was compromised in the first place, and maybe they don't believe you. It's just an ongoing process of education. I don't think legislation is going to solve any of this, because it will just move the goalposts. There will be some new approach, some new technology, or the companies will just offshore it.
And it's an international problem.
They want convenience as well.
Yeah, of course.
And it's international.
And the credit card being compromised. One of my business cards got compromised. Suddenly there was thousands of dollars racked up on it, and I practice fairly good security. So it's just somewhere where I'm paying for something, they've been hacked, and they've been storing the database. They've been storing credit cards in their database in plain text. I can't do anything about that.
Which unfortunately is still happening a lot. I mean, we're even seeing that with passwords. So there's a number of websites that will email you your password. Unless they happen to be using a form of reversible storage, I would guess that they're still storing them in plain text. It's still happening. Those bad practices are there. And of course, there's a mountain of old websites still online. So I was looking at the Have I Been Pawned website, and there was one of my passwords, and it eventually got tracked back to some trivial blog that I'd registered for information for an electrical product. And, this was 5-10 years ago.
You just forget.
And suddenly it appeared.
It's long time ago.
It
comes back to bite you.
Luckily, I had changed my passwords. But 5 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe, I was still using a small set of passwords for most systems. Now I've got over 380 unique passwords. And
I hope you use the password manager for that.
Funnily enough, yes, I've not opted to remember 300 plus 16, 20 character random passwords.
I used to have an algorithm in my mind that I would take the service's name and I'd do this complex maths on the name and come to this password. So I'm so thankful that password managers exist now.
It's better than the typical password rotation requirements in some organizations. People just end up incrementing their passwords.
Yep.
Do you have run-ins with ECU IT?
That's a good question there.
Not as much, no. Funny enough, I had more of a run-in with my previous employer back in the UK. So the university there for a long time had quite strict password practices. And eventually I ended up on various committees relating to security within the organization. And we actually ended up with a really good policy, which was that the password would never expire. And
nice. Much better.
As long as you had a strong password, and if there was any concerns, it was mandatory to replace it. But if there's nothing actually wrong with it, and if it doesn't appear in breach lists, then you can take a little bit of a risk that it's probably safe. At ECU, we have regular password changes. In fact, I did my most recent one 2 days ago. And I do find that irritating. And, I would prefer not to have to do that. ECU as a university, like many in Australia, is quite risk averse. And they've taken the view of having a fairly strict password rotation policy. So I think you can't use any of the last 4 passwords. So the minute you have to remember 5 in sequence, it's just easier to create a new one.
Exactly.
Organizations should just turn on 2-factor authentication, and then.
Well, funny enough, we have done that. So we've not got it currently for login to systems, actually to your desktop, but for most of our Microsoft-based platforms, so things like your Office 365, your email interface, all of those now utilize a 2-factor. So I've got the Authenticator app on my phone, and I find that to be really convenient.
Agreed.
It was quite contentious when it was brought in, particularly as we have a lot of people who travel, and there was concerns about international connectivity. But it's actually gone relatively smoothly, and I believe we're going to be rolling it out to all the students. So, it has been a very successful approach to security that I'm quite pleased with.
Yeah, I have no problems with Office 365 2-factor. It's actually rather painless.
So far, until of course today when you absolutely have to get in there and can't, and then it's a nightmare.
Recovery of the actual 2-factor code is tricky. There was a point where I had to switch phones, and being able to get access to that through SMSs and passwords, and it was a bit of a struggle. But when it works pretty well.
What do you think the biggest threats facing the average person are in terms of cybersecurity?
Yeah, so at the moment, the big threats that users are facing tend to orient around that sort of human factor content. So it's the phishing emails, the spam, little bit of the sort of URL redirecting or domain theft, but all of it ultimately preying on individuals who are not sufficiently savvy with computers or with IT in general to understand the threats that they're facing. So it's individuals being compromised through being directed through websites, through phishing campaigns, drive-by downloads. We're still seeing quite a lot of IoT risks. So with the consumer being very focused on convenience and new sparkly technologies, the number of people with Ring doorbells or with personal assistants, there's just this vast footprint of devices out there on the internet, and enough people looking for holes and vulnerabilities that when they're found, you end up with an army of devices that can be compromised and misused. And we saw that to great effect with the Mirai botnet a couple of years ago, when huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of home users had their personal devices compromised, typically personal video recorders and webcams, and used as the launch point of an attack. So individually, no one would have noticed it, but collectively with hundreds of thousands of, let's say, webcams, all attacking a common destination, the impact was enormous. And that's a relatively small scale incident.
That's the other service I like to show people to scare them is Showdown. Showdown.io.
Showdown is fantastic.
Yeah.
So my favorite Showdown exploit, other than peering into people's bedrooms through webcams, was to look at a funeral director's crematorium system.
Wow.
So this actually came up, I think it was at the Black Hat conference, the Hackers Convention in Las Vegas a couple of years ago. And somebody had, through Showdown, discovered a system. It was DEF CON. So they discovered a system that was basically providing a monitoring interface to a crematorium facility. And you could extract personal information, you could see who was being cremated, but there was also access to the control systems. So, potentially, dangerous situations where you could change the configuration of a cremation process that was happening. And yes, the impact of that would be relatively minor, but distressing for those involved. But the safety perspective, if someone was servicing that system, I'm assuming there are safeguards, but we don't know. But what if
always an unsafe assumption to make, though, isn't it? That there are safeguards, as we will.
It is, and unfortunately, there are so many systems that have been picked up by Showdown, particularly in the area of critical infrastructure. So, yeah, lots of fun just finding unprotected servers and blogs without safeguards on them, downloadable telephone directories. All that stuff is easily searchable. But to find critical infrastructure where you can turn on and off a valve or a control system in a power plant is quite terrifying. And the Showdown platform does a really good job of finding that stuff.
Yeah. People have no idea just how open a lot of these IoT devices are when you put them on the shelf.
It's funny, right? Because IoT was a big industry movement where the Internet of Things, everything's connected together, but it just increases the attack surface as well. So have you got any suggestions or tips for people who are now actually really worried about all their webcams sitting in their homes?
They've just they've just gone to showdown.io and suddenly are aware.
So yeah, we're probably going to be responsible for a spike of Showdown visits. And it really flags the core principles of cybersecurity. And the first of those is simply awareness. So making yourself aware of what you've even got in your home. People buy these devices and they don't really think of them as a computer. And when you think about a printer, and most printers these days connect via Wi-Fi or they connect directly into your network. And you could sort of imagine that as being a computing device. So there may be a bit more awareness of that. But they're really not thinking about personal video recorders, children's toys. Increasingly, kids' toys these days are internet connected. All the personal assistants that we're seeing people buying, all of these bits of tech are sitting in people's homes. Some of them have got cameras on. So a very simple protective mechanism, if you're at all concerned about privacy and particularly breaches of privacy inside the home, just covering up the webcams. Many of the devices have little cameras built into them. If you've got a device with a microphone that you don't want surveilling you, the chances are it's not. But it doesn't take any effort to throw something over it, something to muffle the sound going into the device. Doesn't help if it's a personal assistant and you want to talk to it.
I'm very guilty of that. I turn my PlayStation off and on with my voice, and there's actually a Google Home right there.
Again, it's convenient. It's really
behind
convenient.
me too, yeah.
The other critical thing is, all of these devices generally connect up to accounts. And when you've got a system, for example, that's controlling other bits of equipment, there'll have to be some level of trust between those. And often that's done through an app, sometimes through a website. So going back to what we talked about in terms of passwords, making sure that each system or service or platform uses a unique password. And making those complex passwords, but making them unique. So when it inevitably gets breached, and most services will at some point, and if the listeners are thinking that this is a way to go with major providers is a way to avoid these risks, that doesn't help. Sony have been breached. We had an issue.
Sony's one was huge. The PSN network, I think millions and everyone. There's all plain text passwords as well.
Nobody is immune from this stuff. So having those unique passwords, reducing your risk is absolutely critical.
Sony Pictures.
And then the final aspect is patching. So making sure that your systems are up to date. Now we do that with our computers. We do that with our mobile phones or our tablets. Most people will have those set to auto update, but we don't tend to think about the other devices, and most of them can be updated. So yes, there'll be some for which the manufacturer's gone out of business. Maybe you've got a device you've had in the home for 10 years. I've got a NAS, a network attached storage device. It's been in the house for probably 15 years now. Just keeps working. But I'm not connecting it directly to the internet. I've restricted access to it.
Interesting. A lot of NASs have a cloud service system as well.
I didn't opt into the cloud service.
and they're almost always BSD or Linux based. So there's usually a full operating system.
Yes, right.
Waiting to be used.
And that's the other thing, is that all of these effectively are mini computers. They're running an operating system, commonly a Linux or Unix-based platform, which isn't an operating system most people will be familiar with. It's not Windows. It's hiding away internally in the system, and it's really low powered in most cases. So it doesn't have an antivirus. It doesn't have a firewall, and it can't really protect itself. So anytime we open it up to the internet and utilize it remotely, it has that risk that it could be compromised.
Is this a fear you have that once, next year when IP version 6 gets adopted,
next year,
the year after, the year after?
One of the big things of that is moving away from NAT, obviously, and everything in your network will have its own addressable IP address, which is great for people who know how to set a firewall, but the average user doesn't even know what a firewall is.
I think the good thing is, despite IPv6 coming again very soon to a home near you, realistically, it's not going to be coming to a home near you anytime soon. All of the consumer devices built in the last, let's say, 5 years will probably support IPv6, but most home users' environments simply don't use it. And even when we've got the ability to have enough IP addresses under IPv6 to accommodate globally all of the devices, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll all be publicly visible. And there'll still be a role for an IPv6 to v4 gateway and to utilize private network addressing within your home, or to, maybe for the ISPs to take the lead on this. And much as they did with Wi-Fi routers, moving from a sort of default open mode to then adopting WEP to then adopting WPA, they improved things over time. They introduced unique SSIDs and unique keys for their encryption algorithms, where it used to be a generic one for all users. They took the lead and they started to do things primarily being driven by demand. But as we move to IPv6, I'm sure that eventually they will implement some level of safeguards as standard into their devices, and they will eventually come into the play in people's homes as we finally move to IPv6 fully. But I still think we're probably more than a decade away from that being a fully
at least
environment.
What do you think the future of cybersecurity is Is it more focus on smartphones, or is that already the past? Have we already reached peak cybersecurity threats coming in via smartphones and devices that people bring into organizations?
I think for organizations, we've still got an issue with the BYOD brigade. We still have increasing numbers of users bringing in multiple mobile devices. It's no longer a single device anymore. It may be multiples. We still have an issue with them being connected to insecure environments outside of the organization. But it's increasingly recognized now that they're just computers. It's no longer about, is it a mobile? Is it in the organization? It's simply about securing the endpoints, whatever they may be. And in terms of cybersecurity going forwards, it's much more about things like automation. So, when we look at the attackers, even the attackers are using technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning to better enable their attacks. And a good example from, I think it was a year ago, with a phishing campaign that was utilizing a sort of machine learning algorithm to optimize the phishing attacks to ensure that they didn't get detected by either machines, engines that detected the phishing attacks themselves, or by the humans looking at them and determining that they were in fact false. So they've been learning how to better evade detection, whether that be automated or machine. And at the same time, the cybersecurity vendors, security operation centers like this are now using those same technologies to detect attacks more efficiently because of the increased levels of traffic that we're seeing. So as we often see with the game of cat and mouse, as one side gets better at a particular technology and solving problems, the other side very quickly bolsters their defenses or their attack techniques. And we're already seeing the use of AI and machine learning by attackers to find ways to inject traffic into networks that helps to mask the true attack traffic.
Wow.
So by generating enough noise to wrap around your real attack that perhaps does trigger the alerting systems, then it moves the operators in the SOCs away from the real threat traffic. So that will then trigger a fresh wave of development and research to find ways to detect, and it just goes on and on and on.
Full arms race, isn't it?
I think we're just going to see a lot more in the AI, machine learning, automation. Unfortunately, we're going to see a lot more of things like blockchain. And that's something that I don't want to see a lot more attention given to. Not least from an environmental perspective, it's going to kill the planet. But it's not a technology that's going to solve the main problems that we're facing in cybersecurity, whereas tools like AI and machine learning.
That's an interesting one. I have to jump in.
In the spirit of transparency, we do a bit of blockchain work.
Yeah, so let me jump in here. What kind of security applications does blockchain even have? I've never heard of a security aspect to it.
So in theory, if we take it as an in principle, there's lots of great applications to blockchain within cyber. So within cyber, particularly when you're dealing with forensics, for example, you want to be able to very easily and very clearly verify the authenticity of your evidence. And evidence in cases used to be oriented around hard disks, and so you might have a 100 gig hard disk, and then it became a 500 gig, and then a terabyte. So you can imagine the process involved in verifying the authenticity of the evidence become much more challenging. When you then begin to look at network traffic and cloud-based infrastructure, the scale of the problem just grows and grows and grows. So to have some means of verifying, particularly across borders and across organizations, to verify authenticity, to verify the validity of the data you're looking at, blockchain potentially could have applications there, because you could have a verifiable chain of trust. You could rely upon the authenticity of others to verify that evidence. And you could not have to worry about having all of the evidence stored in one place potentially. There's a number of
it feels theoretical, doesn't it?
It's very theoretical. And I'm not a fan of utilizing blockchain within security. I think
agree.
The scale of the problems we're looking at the sort of energy trade-off that we often talk about is really not favorable for cyber. I think there's many more areas. But if you look at it from the perspective of governance and for compliance, then there could well be opportunities again for blockchain within cyber, within organizations. So just in the way that information is stored and verified within maybe a large organization, perhaps blockchain could have an application. I and many others often say that blockchain is the solution waiting for a problem. And I think, to be fair, that's tempered by my perspectives in cybersecurity. But yeah, so far, I've not yet seen a really useful application. But in cyber and in computing, you don't ever make predictions because things change so quickly that by tomorrow, there could be a fresh problem for which it is the perfect solution.
What's the biggest incoming threat that you see? I mean, is it still just smarter and smarter ransomware? Is it these like using machine learning to actually power these kinds of exploits on people?
I think at the moment there's a number of big threats that are currently permeating in the sort of cyberspace. And ransomware is an issue that's appeared in the last few years. It has grown to notoriety in the last couple with some really big targets. Ransomware is still going to be hitting organizations. They're becoming more aware of it. The technology vendors are getting better at blocking it, but we always have those new threats coming along. So I think ransomware will still be prevalent. For me, the big concern with ransomware, and it's one that's being predicted by a number of the security vendors, is major ransomware hits against cloud infrastructure. So we're seeing ransomware hitting, obviously, the virtualized instances in the cloud of an operating system. So your classic Windows instance, Windows Server may be being hit in the cloud. And at the end of the day, that's just a system running somewhere. It doesn't really matter that it's cloud-based. The big risk is, should the ransomware be able to get to the hypervisor? So the minute we get ransomware in the hypervisor or in some layer of the abstraction that goes on between that VM all the way down to the bare metal, that opens up enormous risks. And you could imagine if that were to hit in the core of the Amazon AWS or the Microsoft Azure platforms, the level of damage that could cause and the speed at which replication occurs would potentially mean that it could propagate incredibly quickly and affect a vast number of hosts. It's almost like the golden opportunity for a cyber criminal. If you could get into that low level and hit the infrastructure at the core, then your target audience for your ransom would be vast. And the potential payoff could be enormous. Obviously, the level of interest you'd get from federal agencies would be through the roof, but you could make a very significant amount of money very quickly. And having been through an instance where a cloud platform was lost, so this isn't related to the university itself, but in regards to some of the services we were using, we lost an entire set of instances and they were irrecoverable. And it was nothing to do with ransomware. It was a technical problem, but it was irrecoverable. Now, if you've got a major organization that shifted all their infrastructure into the cloud, that's a real big concern.
Whole business gone, whole company. Business. Well, and I think meltdown, the meltdown flaw in Intel chips really exposes the potential for that. And have they fixed that yet? I haven't stayed up to date, I must admit.
It was Spectre for a while. Meltdown, haven't really looked at.
I'm not aware of it having been fixed properly. And of course, fixing it doesn't mean it's deployed.
Yeah, that's right.
And we already know from Microsoft patches that the patch cycle for some organizations is measured in months. So when you're dealing with a critical issue with infrastructure, you're talking seconds potentially before exploitation. It's just how long it takes for the bad actors to recognize the threat and to mobilize their forces and to attack. And let's be honest, they're very motivated and the payoff could be huge. So they would be looking for these potential threats. Just in terms of other major potential risks going forwards, I think the other big critical area is critical infrastructure. And we've already seen a number of attacks against critical infrastructure, but we are living in very turbulent political times. And we can't underestimate the threats that nation states play. And all states are involved in covert activities of various kinds. And unfortunately, politics changes on a regular basis. So we know that there are whole teams of suitably motivated attackers in certain countries who are simply waiting for a target. And the cost of entry to do that is very low. If you've got the intellectual talent within a country, it's not like mobilizing a military force. You don't need to build barracks. You don't need to establish weaponry. You just need a computer. In many cases, a computer and Shodan. And once you've got those technologies combined, you can do a lot of damage. And most of the tools you need are not secret. They are out on the internet. And even when they're developed secretly, as we saw with the various NSA attacks coming out of the US, sooner or later they get leaked. And you have a whole team of bad actors who then take that intellectual property and weaponize it.
We had these CIA hacking,
still suffering now.
The CIA hacking tools be leaked.
Yeah,
I think that some information just came out about that today, actually. All the top secret CIA hacking tools leaked.
Security through obscurity never works in the end.
It never pays off.
That's right. So back a bit on the education of cybersecurity for the average person. So we're seeing the first generation, the young generation today, just growing up with broadband. It's a crazy thought, but do you think we're doing enough, like at early stages of someone's life, to be able to educate them on cybersecurity? And if not, what can we do? What's missing?
You teach your kid to lock the front door, right? But do you teach them to put a password?
Like generate passwords, yeah.
There's definitely a lot of work to do in that domain. I can genuinely say it has improved. So when I look at what was being taught, particularly at schools, and really this needs to start at primary level. So I've got two children in primary school. They are both actively using iPads in the school environment. And when they come home and they show me the password that they created to log into System X, it is rather disappointing as a cybersecurity expert to see such bad password practice. But we have to recognize that it needs to be tempered for the age range. It has to be appropriate. So teaching a 5-year-old about the values of a 20-character alphanumeric, complex
high entropy password,
it's not going to work. And in fact, there's some really interesting work being done looking at graphical passwords, so pictorial-based passwords for primary school children, as a way to introduce the concepts of cybersecurity. Here at ECU, we do a lot of outreach work with schools, so primarily at the secondary level, but we do go into primary schools and we do provide awareness raising activities. But I think that there's a lot more work that can be done particularly in the primary sector, to introduce the base concepts of cyber. And all too often there's a focus on cyber safety as opposed to cyber security. So having good values, and there's nothing wrong with that. And appropriate etiquette online is an important skill, a life skill for students to learn. But all too often, kids these days are using adult services. They are to be found on Facebook, and they're going into environments where they don't have the appropriate skills and knowledge to behave in an appropriate way and to be safe. So I think there's a lot more work needed.
Sensitive material on things like iCloud.
There is that also exposure to material. So things like YouTube. I know YouTube Kids is one thing, but so many kids are using YouTube, particularly at the moment for teaching purposes. Both of my children are being told to go and visit YouTube to download content. But of course, other videos come up and I have no control over that content, and neither does the school. And unfortunately, they are being exposed to content that I would consider to be inappropriate. And, I have to step in from time to time and, change the page. But a bit more awareness is definitely needed at the school level. And, certainly ECU is trying to play a part in that. We've got a number of programs starting in the next year that will be working with schools in the region. And we're hoping to have influence over things like curriculum in time to further embed those skills at appropriate early ages.
I have a good feeling about the general cybersecurity talent of the young kids, though. We actually recently attended WA Capture the Flag, the hacking competition, and we got stomped by really young kids. Really young kids.
That's right.
Yeah, they dominated us.
Quite remarkable at how well they soak up that knowledge.
That's right.
We've done a few training sessions with schools to try and support them in their CTF endeavors, because it is becoming a very popular thing, and it's really cool and trendy for the kids to do as well. And probably if they're watching this, they'll think, how dare he say cool and trendy, you grey-haired old prof. But the stuff they're doing is incredible, and we want to capitalize on that. So things like WACTF, we support as a university. We encourage the schools in our network to participate, and we'd like to see more of that, because that's a great way to teach and reinforce cyber skills.
Well, back when I learned, it was just because I'd been let loose on the internet.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure that all three of us participated in the initial days of hacking, when hacking meant something entirely different.
Yes.
And, I can still remember the days of trying to get my 386 to boot up, and the autoexec.bat. And it does raise an interesting question in cyber, particularly because the kids that we're seeing now, just about now coming into higher education, have grown up with what we often refer to as the appization of computing. And a lot of those core skills are now missing. And it's proven to be a bit of a challenge for us. And we have to go back and cover ground that we thought would just be, everyone knows that stuff. But, people are not now being exposed to even things like file systems.
Yeah, just tinkering in general. Yeah. On the topic of the talent we have here in Perth, you mentioned that you came to Australia some years ago. So is there a reason you picked Perth in the first place, or did you visit the other cities? And if you did pick Perth for a specific reason,
why was it the beaches?
What is our standing in the whole cybersecurity aspect? Because it's a global discipline now. Where does Perth really sit in all that?
So for me, looking for a job opportunity, which was what drove my move to Australia, I was browsing, looking for opportunities. So it was very fortuitous that the role that I applied for became available. So it wasn't that I looked specifically initially at Australia or indeed Perth. I did know of Perth before. I had visited many, many years previously. I actually attended a conference run out of ECU.
Oh, wow.
And I also had contacts with ECU. And funnily enough, in my former role in the UK, I employed a former academic from ECU. And we became very good friends. And when I moved here, I actually stayed with him for a few weeks. So I've had a natural interest in Edith Cowan University particularly, and Perth, but it was really just the opportunity that arose. But when I began to look into the job and went through the process of applying, it was very impressive how ECU, as a relatively small university in a very isolated part of the country, was effectively leading cyber. It was and is the leading cyber institution within Australia, and indeed, I would say within the Southern Hemisphere.
Wow.
The scale of activities here, the pedigree that has evolved, the fact that cyber courses have been taught here since before cyber was a thing. So, 20 years ago, the cyber courses began in terms of things like computing with cyber or cyber majors. And for more than a decade, nearly 15 years, the pure cybersecurity courses have been delivered here. So absolutely, they were leading the way in terms of cyber. And since I've arrived here, I've been here 4 years now, and cyber has exploded. We now have more than 1,100 students studying pure cybersecurity. That's not even the majors, it's not even the elective units. That's the actual cybersecurity courses. So the numbers are just vast. And we are fantastically positioned to exploit that, because we've got a tremendous working relationship with WA Gov, and they're leading the way through the Department of Premier and Cabinet in terms of evolving technologies and exploiting the value of technology for government and obviously the electorate's use. And we've got some tremendous companies within the WA region in terms of cyber. And of course, we're the gateway to Singapore and then to the
Yeah.
rest of the Asia Pacific region. So it's a fantastic location. And it's been an absolute privilege to be here. I've thoroughly enjoyed it from day one. And let's be honest, the weather is a little bit better than the UK. There's a few other benefits as well.
Even today, it was raining
even
so
today,
bad.
Even that rain, it's finished, it's over.
It's still fairly sunny this morning.
That's right.
We had a little bit of rain earlier.
With your cyber students, do you teach them the other side? You know, the how these hacks
offensive.
Do you actually teach them both sides of the?
Yeah. Absolutely. So it is absolutely critical for anyone studying cyber to have an appreciation of the dark side. You cannot attempt to defend an infrastructure or a network unless you've got at least a vague understanding of the techniques and technologies that the attackers will use. So I've always been a firm believer that in any cybersecurity course, you have to have an element of the offensive. Some courses will focus on the defensive, some will focus on the offensive. I would suggest that ECU is roughly balanced, probably slightly more towards the defensive, but we absolutely recognize the value of teaching the offensive activities, but from an ethical standpoint. So whilst we'll expose the students to the hacking techniques and the tools that are used by the criminals, we do so within a very rigid framework. We're very clear about the use, the targets, and we utilize very strictly controlled virtualized environments to do that. So it's a critical part of the teaching, but it's not one that we take lightly.
Do your students ever do war games?
They do. So we tend to engage mainly in things like CTFs. And we have now got some brand new facilities here. So we've just spent $2 million on facilities here at the Joondalup campus. And that includes a red and blue teaming room.
Brilliant.
So we've got a dedicated space. So we've got this fantastic room, a security operations center. In fact, we've got a second one just opposite that seats 24. So we can train people in SOC operations. But directly opposite me, I've got the red and blue room. And that allows us to divide it to 60-seat space. And we can have two 30-person teams split between the two rooms doing attack and defense activities between the two. Although we're currently talking about a scenario where we're going to have 60 attackers and there'll be the defenders sitting in the SOC in the room next door who will be monitoring and defending their infrastructure. So yeah, we definitely do a whole variety of team activities. And then we also compete both nationally and internationally in the various CTFs and other competitions.
Fantastic.
On the topic of, you mentioned the dark side. I've been watching Star Wars lately, and is there a very careful approach on how you teach ethics to the cybersecurity students during their course?
Absolutely. So it is obviously critical that we do so from an ethical perspective, and particularly where you're looking at perhaps the younger end of the spectrum who may not have their moral compass fully established. We go to great extents to reinforce the messaging around the appropriate protocols. So we very much come at it from the perspective of penetration testing or ethical hacking, and we look at the role of the sort of initial briefing sessions and the importance of defining parameters, seeking permissions, and protocols and frameworks for conducting the activity safely. And then a big focus on the reporting side, because it's no good doing all that work if you don't then report it appropriately. We also cover off on the legal and governance side of things. So we make it very clear that all of this has to happen within a legal framework, and that framework differs between jurisdictions and particularly globally when you're dealing with multinationals. So we do have a very strong focus on the ethics and the governance side of things.
Brilliant. So personal question, your personal desktop, are you running Windows, Mac or Linux?
And Vim or Emacs?
Which one?
Which Linux? That's a good question.
So which desktop?
Good point.
My university systems are predominantly Windows. So the university is a Microsoft platform, and I probably am most at home with a Windows system in front of me. The machine I'm currently talking to you on is a Microsoft Surface Book, so I'm a great fan of those little devices. But at home, I predominantly use Macs. So I've
Cool.
got a real split,
Yeah.
and I still do a lot of development work under Linux environments. And I absolutely love tinkering around with Raspberry Pis. In fact, some of my commercial endeavors in the UK, developing industrial systems, were based around Raspberry Pis and other embedded Linux systems.
Oh, fantastic.
So I cover all potential areas. And at the moment, I'm just getting a bit of time to play around with the BBC microbit and embedding little bits of code into those. So yeah, I like to play around and tinker with technology.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm glad you said that.
It's a loaded question.
It was, yeah. I was really trying to trip you up there. Okay.
No, I cover all platforms, but if I'm honest, my preferred environment for most things is Windows. But yeah, I like to play with everything.
Yeah, excellent.
Well, as a final question, what is your preferred editor to program in?
Oh, now that's another good question. I'm old school. Not so old school that I'd go VI or Emacs or anything like that,
Okay.
Although I use those very regularly. I like Notepad++.
Wow.
Oh, nice.
So I still do a lot of web programming, so particularly PHP, and I have never really used a proper code editor. And some people would argue Notepad++ is a code editor, but I'm thinking in terms of a full IDE environment. I've used them where I've had to, but I prefer to hand code, and so Notepad++ is my preferred.
Do you express this? Do you express this philosophy to other cybersecurity students and tell them what editor they should be using? I
encourage people to utilize command line. So I think that if you're going to work in cyber, because whenever I don't do much teaching anymore, but whenever I'm in a room and students are trying to use platforms, particularly Kali Linux, which is our sort of standard platform, they always go for the GUI interface. They always go for the GUI-based tools. And ZenMap would be a good example of this. So a GUI-based tool for probing for network-based systems. And there's nothing wrong with it. But if you can't use Nmap at a command prompt, then how are you going to resolve problems when the GUI doesn't work? And I think it is absolutely critical that if you're going to do programming, that you need to have some exposure to doing stuff in a command line, at a text editor, to manually compile stuff, because it just gives you that view of what's going on under the hood.
Last question. We're going to go a little bit political. What are your thoughts on the Assistance and Access Act, the undermining encryption law that was passed? Was it last year, the year before? Where the government can force people to force software developers and cloud infrastructure companies to install backdoors into their encryption.
It's a very difficult one, and it's one that I have mixed views, as do many people in the IT domain. So absolutely, I recognize the challenge for investigative agencies to legitimately undertake operations. And few people would argue that those kind of institutions, organizations, need some way of investigating crimes, particularly terrorism related, against our adversaries. And it's the usual thing, it's fine for them, but not for me. Realistically, you can never have a solution that cherry picks who the target is.
Yes.
And then when you look at it from the technology side, the minute you introduce any kind of a hole, a backdoor, a weakness, a third-party key, whatever the technology solution is, we know from decades worth of cybersecurity breaches that any weakness will eventually be exploited. And for those same agencies to claim that the way that this will be done will be secure is very naive. And we know that that's also not going to work. So in a way, I don't really have an answer to the question, because I think that we have to have solutions that allow for interception, legitimate interception, warranted interception by appropriate agencies. But from a technology perspective, implementing that is very likely to lead to bigger holes. And ultimately, all that will happen is, should providers be forced to implement those mechanisms and people become aware of them, they will vote with their feet and use other technology solutions. And that's where end-to-end security is now so common and so popular, because it removes the opportunity for an intermediary to intercept things. At which point we go back to the cat and mouse game. So you develop a solution and the agencies then complain they can't intercept. So another technology backdoor is inserted, and then another technology is developed to bypass that problem. And it'll just go round and round and round. I think ultimately the needs for industry, particularly in the banking and finance sector, to have secure environments that don't have backdoors, that can't be exploited by cyber criminals, will eventually outweigh the demands of the government agencies to have access to those same systems. They'll have to find other ways of compelling access to those. And I don't know what that would be, and it may well be that there isn't a solution to any of this, but we're always going to have that challenge between the legitimate access and the needs of individuals to be secure, and the desire of third parties, and particularly aggressors, including foreign governments, to misuse those systems.
It's a good answer. Yeah.
I'm trying to be politically
yeah.
It's a hard one.
Yeah.
In between.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, one more question. Sorry. Quantum encryption. Thoughts on quantum encryption? I noticed you put in your technology-related gripes, quantum crypto not going to be here anytime soon.
Yeah, quantum cryptography is an interesting area. It's certainly not one that I'm technologically capable to comment on in terms of the likely trends and where it's going into the future. At the moment, it's simply not a viable option. The size of devices that are being constructed, the number of qubits that are capable within an affordable solution, means that we're not being threatened by a quantum cryptography problem just yet. But if quantum cryptography becomes a real thing, if systems are developed that have the ability, as is predicted, to be able to determine keys instantaneously for cryptographically encrypted things, whatever they may be, and particularly with government storing information protected by historically the DES algorithm, then triple DES, and more recently with the use of the AES algorithm, I think that there are real concerns over what the future might hold for quantum cryptography. I don't think it's ever going to be as big of an issue as people think, because the costs of running it at the scale that would be needed are going to push the likely users of that to be a very, very small number of countries. Unfortunately, I think it will be a major problem for the US because they will have some adversaries who will have the capabilities, both technical and financial, to be able to bypass whatever cryptographic techniques they're using, at which point overnight they will need to find a quantum cryptography solution to encrypt their vast volumes of data very, very, very quickly, which technically would be achievable with quantum cryptography.
True.
But I don't think it's going to be that much of an issue just yet. And I think from an end user perspective, it's really not going to be much of a threat because the cyber criminals are not going to have access to that technology probably within the next 25 years. But we've been proven wrong before.
Is it more akin to nuclear armament then? Is it more like a nuclear arms race, like the cyber equivalent?
It is. I think the problem there is that home users will never have the technology in their hands that can enable any kind of quantum cryptography, at least not within my lifetime, I suspect. So if the problem is that end users are still reliant on, let's say, HTTPS to communicate with a bank, for example, and if a nation state were to want to extract large amounts of money by targeting individuals through some mass attack, through, let's suggest that a country not too far away from us sells Australia a whole bunch of hardware for the 5G network, so not naming any names, and that infrastructure allowed them to intercept encrypted traffic that currently is not financially viable to reverse, but with quantum cryptography would be, then suddenly you have access to, let's say, the bank accounts of every Australian. That's the kind of problem we're likely to be facing at some point in the future. And that would be very hard to defend against because you couldn't implement the quantum crypto solutions at the end user level. So I think that there's a whole bunch of issues that will come out here. The first will be nation states attacking nation states, but it could be that at some point in the future, the technology reaches the level where it's achievable by a criminal gang, for example, a highly motivated, well-funded criminal gang, but they are out there because they're currently engaging in phishing campaigns and direct attacks against Australians.
You could also include countries like North Korea who engage in crime to get around the
various restrictions on their
economy,
importation of goods and services.
Yeah.
There's several countries who would have the political motivation to undertake these kind of crimes, as well as the resources to be able to do that. And there's a few countries who are very open about the fact that they are building vast cyber armies. Now, it would be naive to think that every country isn't doing this, because of course they're all doing it to some extent or other. But there are certain countries who are very well motivated and very well equipped. And the finger of blame is already being pointed at them for various major incidents. And that will only continue. And quantum will just be the new ground on which the warfare is undertaken.
Scary.
Yeah. Scary indeed. And we didn't even talk about critical infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. That was a really interesting conversation.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Paul.
My pleasure. Lovely to speak to you guys.
Yeah, you too.
And look forward to seeing the outcomes of all of this.
You've made it to the end of another episode of Tech Society. If this episode has scared you witless, let us know by tweeting us at Tech Society. Next episode drops this coming Wednesday, so make sure you tune in. As always, Tech Society is sponsored by Ninja Software.